Imagine a continent systematically stripped of its land, its people enslaved, its future mortgaged before it even began. This isn't fiction, it's the hidden history of Africa, a history of injustice that continues to cast a long shadow. We delve into the cold cases of colonial conquest, the systematic exploitation that shaped the continent and left deep scars that refuse to heal. How can a continent recover from centuries of theft? We begin our investigation in 1652, at the Cape of Good Hope. Dutch East India Company settlers arrived, marking the beginning of a brutal chapter in South African history. This wasn't just settlement, it was the opening salvo in a war for land and resources. By 1658, the first enslaved people arrived, initiating a system of forced labor that would reshape the social and economic landscape of the colony. Fast forward to 1806, when Britain seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch. The numbers tell a horrifying story: 30,000 enslaved people, 26,000 settlers, and a mere 20,000 free-collared, normal, and people in white employment. It was a society built on inequality, a powder keg of racial division. The injustice wasn't merely about land seizure, it was about the importation and expansion of slave labor, a system that ripped families apart and denied basic human rights. The tentacles of colonial control tightened further in 1856 with the Masters and Servants Act. This legislation formalized a system of labor control over black workers, laying the groundwork for the even more oppressive apartheid regime that would follow. Shifting our focus north, we arrive in Kenya, where the story of land alienation takes on a particularly brutal dimension. From 1902 onwards, British colonial policy systematically dispossessed indigenous communities of their ancestral lands. A staggering 5.5 million acres were taken out of a total of 6.75 million, leaving Africans confined to reserves, a system designed to control and exploit their labor. This wasn't just about acquiring land, it was a deliberate strategy to undermine indigenous food systems and livelihoods, creating long-term rural inequality. The period between the 1910s and 1950s saw an intensification of land alienation and forced removals. Large-scale displacement, often tied to settler agriculture and the Mau Mau era, caused immense suffering. One particularly harrowing case saw 115,000 people forcibly removed to Gwosi, a place of disease, malnutrition, and death. The conditions were so harsh that many perished, a stark reminder of the brutality of colonial rule. Colonial dispossession wasn't just about impoverishment, it led to livestock losses, starvation, and killings. Some historians and scholars argue that these policies constitute a form of ethnic cleansing. But the story doesn't end with independence. The Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, first took up the cause of reparations for historical crimes against Africans and people of African descent in 1963. The fight for justice continues to this day. In 2013, the UK government settled claims related to abuses against civilians during the Mau Mau liberation movement in Kenya, a small but significant step towards acknowledging the wrongs of the past. However, the legacy of colonial injustice continues to shape modern Africa. Contemporary debates over land reform, heritage restitution, decolonization, and economic sovereignty are all tied to these historical crimes. Amnesty International's 2025 regional overview shows that many African states still face rights violations involving forced evictions, displacement, and lack of accountability, keeping land and justice questions politically relevant. The unresolved legacy of colonial land loss is visible in ongoing disputes over land tenure, agrarian inequality, and urban displacement in several African countries. Reparations discussions are increasingly connecting historical injustice to illicit financial flows, debt, and unequal global institutions, not just to colonial-era crimes. One of the major controversies surrounding historical injustice is whether colonial crimes should be treated as symbolic wrongs or as grounds for material compensation and restitution. In Kenya, the legacy of colonial violence against Mau Mau fighters and civilians was long downplayed. An official acknowledgement came only much later, including the 2013 UK settlement. In South Africa, historical narratives often emphasize apartheid while giving less public attention to the earlier Dutch and British conquest, slavery, and land dispossession that predated apartheid. The term land alienation itself sanitizes the violence involved in colonial land seizure and forced removal, obscuring the true extent of the suffering. African reparations politics can be controversial because some governments and external actors frame reparations as politically symbolic, while African institutions increasingly argue they must address structural inequality and not just compensation. Some historical injustices are still underdocumented in public memory because the surviving colonial record often reflects the perspective of the colonizing state rather than the affected communities. These injustices helped create durable inequalities in land ownership, wealth, labor access, and political power that shaped post-colonial states. In Kenya, land alienation undermined indigenous food systems and livelihoods and helped create the long-run rural inequality that still drives land conflict today. In South Africa, the combined system of conquest, slavery, labor control, and racial rule laid the groundwork for later apartheid-era inequality and the continuing racial wealth gap. The broader African reparations movement treats historical injustice as a present-day development issue, arguing that global trade, finance, and governance structures still reproduce colonial extraction. The concept itself is legally and morally important because historical injustice refers to past wrongs with lasting effect on living people, which is the basis for claims to restitution and reparations. The African Union and related continental actors continue to place reparatory justice on the political agenda, linking it to land, development, and global economic reform. The fight for justice continues, driven by the belief that Africa's stolen legacy must be acknowledged and addressed. The path to healing is long and complex, but it begins with truth, accountability, and a commitment to building a more just and equitable future. The story of historical injustice in Africa is a story of resilience, resistance, and the enduring pursuit of justice. It's a story that demands to be told, and a story that must never be forgotten.